I think the emphasis on ecumenical dialogue is quite interesting and quite powerful. I think that the seeming commitment to nonviolence is quite strong. I think, the Gezi protests and the sort of fallouts. I think. Social actions, spiritual. With a number of people. My name is T.L. Hill. I'm an associate professor at Temple University's Fox School of Business, where I run both our MBA program and our consulting program. Through John Paul, who teaches here at the Lutheran Seminary. He has a program which is called MAPLE, but it's essentially a way for lay people to be involved in leadership in the church. And some of those students take classes at the business school at Temple University. And so, because I teach social entrepreneurship, many of the students end up in my classes, and we've got sort of a connection. And so John and I met through the students, and he's a friend of the Hizmet movement, and so introduced me. And we actually did a paper together about the Hizmet schools as an example of social entrepreneurship and social justice. I'm still figuring out my view about the Hizmet movement. What it reminds me of more than anything else is in Latin America, there was something, the big liberation theology movement amongst Christians. And in the liberation theology movement, there's this emphasis on getting together and reading scriptures together, and then applying it, thinking, what does this mean for my life? And going out and doing something. And the people I've met in the Hizmet movement seem to have a similar approach. You know, I'm trying to be a better more religious person, but I'm not just going to read, I'm not just going to think, I'm going to do something. And so let's go out and volunteer, do service, that kind of thing. So there's a real familiarity there, or similarity there. I mean, obviously it's an Islamic movement, so there's, Islam is at the heart, and the Quran is at the heart of this, and that's, God is at the heart of everything that's happening, and that is powerful, but frankly, you see that in a lot of faith-based movements. There'll be something at the heart. I think the emphasis on ecumenical dialogue is quite interesting and quite powerful. I think that the seeming commitment to nonviolence is quite strong, and I guess that's where my personal connection comes in, because my whole career has been built around a commitment to nonviolent and nonviolent action, particularly. And it seems, I feel that, it feels like a resonance there. Obviously, if you compare that to some of the media images of Islam in the United States, it's very different. But I think that in the Islamic world, it's maybe unusual. I don't really know. I think it is unusual in the amount of commitment to nonviolence and the amount of commitment to action and to community, but that it's not. And that's pretty core to the central beliefs as I understand them. And so that the sort of, the other side, the more violent, more radical side, is maybe a little bit more unusual, even though it gets more of the press. So it's nice to see, the positive vision get some press. What stands out about the Hizmet movement compared to other social movements, I think there are many social movements that are action-oriented, but not particularly spiritual. And there are many social movements that are sort of spiritual and even service-oriented, but not particularly action-oriented in the larger sense of building an organization, trying to actually make real change in society or in something like education or in healthcare or whatever. And so to get both together, I think that's what's unusual and sort of exciting. Is very strong faith commitment, but also very strong commitment to doing something, to action. And to genuinely changing the world. It's not just what you might call palliative. It's not just, patting people, helping a little bit. It's actually trying to change an underlying structure, trying to make there be better dialogue between religions, trying to be better schools, not just sort of a good enough school, but actually better education more broadly, better healthcare more broadly, better media and sort of civic dialogue more broadly. So that's pretty interesting. Interfaith dialogue is always a good thing, and where to me it gets exciting is when it actually turns into interfaith action. So one of my heroes, and I spent some time as a young man in India working in very rural, very poor sections of India with a number of people inspired by Gandhi. And at the best, the Gandhian movement had Hindu strains, Muslim strains, Christian strains, even animist strains, people from all those traditions working together to make change. And you could really see that in certain communities, particularly in the south of India where I spent some time. And this has a similar feel. But again, it's the moving beyond just talk to action that I think becomes really interesting. So the schools are, of course, inspiring, and I think they're one of the things that certainly drew me there. I think draw a lot of other people who aren't necessarily drawn, if you're not drawn by the faith connection first, this may be the next thing that's visible. I haven't seen enough yet, again, to form a, sort of a considered judgment, but the schools that I've seen have all been impressive in the energy that the teachers put in. So, the students seem excited and engaged. You can tell when there's a good buzz, not silent, not uproarious, but just kind of a buzz. So you get that buzz, so you know that the education is decent, just as a quick measure. And you get a sense of passion from the teachers that go beyond their particular subject, to really a sense of trying to build the whole child and also build a community. And that seems, the best schools always have that, and there aren't too many of those. So if in fact the whole network of schools has that same feel, that's truly impressive. So one of my areas of interest is social entrepreneurship. I actually ran a publishing company for a number of years that was a social venture. So we were, in fact, a group of people who ran it together as a collective. And we did books on nonviolence and social change, nonviolence and social action, spiritual sources of nonviolence, a whole variety of different things, including an early book on Islam and nonviolence. And that experience was formative, so I continue now to study that as I go forward. And so this has this movement, the schools in particular, but I think some of the other elements have a lot of the elements of what I think about as social entrepreneurship. And so the driving force is looking for to create wealth that's beyond economic wealth. So social wealth, spiritual wealth, kind of, again, the whole person, the whole society. And trying to then organize the way you do the work and the way that you raise the money and the other resources needed for the work to make that social wealth happen. It's very exciting when you see it happen. It's very hard to pull off. Business itself is hard. Schools are hard. Everything's hard. When you try to put it together, it's extra hard. But it's also extra exciting. And so it seems like the schools have done a really interesting job of, pulling economic resources from committed business people who share some of the same philosophy and can provide early economic, but not relying on charity long term. Slowly building their local economic base through tuitions, through family support, through government support when appropriate and when possible, to end up with a truly sustained organization. And so I was really interested in talking to some of the people from Kazakhstan. I think it's been about 15 years that it took to get to being totally self-funded, but they got there, right? And that speaks, I think, to a lot of elements. The ambition to be self-funded is exciting, but also the patience of the original investors who were willing to wait 15 years and not necessarily see a huge economic return, because the return that they were seeing was in social and in spiritual sort of terms, not just in economic terms. So it's nice to get the money back, but it's even nicer when kids get educated, community is built, certain set of values get exposed and talked about. So with the Gezi protests and the sort of fallout after that, I think, and Ghazi and I were just talking about this a little bit in the car, there's a way in which Hizmet's tradition of being non-political maybe was challenged a little bit, because there was a number of years in which Hizmet and the current government had common cause around things like the Constitution. There are things they worked together on, which hopefully were good things, and everyone's happy with those. But the interests now seem to have diverged. So you've got a political group that's very much focused on, like any political party, on its power, its strength, and Turkey as an expression of political power. And then you've got the Hizmet group, which is focused on something different. It seems to be focused mostly on a set of spiritual and community sort of values and guides. And it makes them maybe both sides uncomfortable. It certainly makes political side uncomfortable to have a group that has been an ally but isn't necessarily thinking the same thing, has different priorities. That's always going to make you uncomfortable if you're a political person. And on the community side, maybe the same thing. If you're sort of used to a little bit of ease with the government, and all of a sudden that ease is less, kind of back to the old days. Instead of being the generals, it's the AK, and now we're trying to figure out what our relationship is and trying to not get entangled in the politics. But you asked a question about whether it's sort of in some sense Turkish enough to be global, and I think that really depends on whether or not Hizmet movement sees itself as a Muslim movement or sees itself as a Turkish movement, because if it's primarily about Islam and about the central commitments to God and to those values and to nonviolence, then that's by nature going to be global, and should be global. Not global in the hegemonic sense, not global in the sense of trying to take over, but global in the sense of trying to be a partner to everybody. If Hizmet thinks about itself as primarily Turkish, now we're talking about something else. It's like, are we sort of the new Ottomans? I don't get the impression that that's the direction that the movement is going, although there's always parallel states are an interesting thing. As somebody who's been involved with nonviolent direct action, I know that political movements often try to create other sources of power, and that becomes a very important counterweight in countries. So that, for instance, you want to have a really good press because things like there's always sort of backroom deals in politics, and no country is immune to that, and so it's useful to have a press with bright lights shining into the dark corners and saying, hey, come on. So that's a good countervailing force, right? And I think that in most societies there are forces that do that. Actually, as an example, we just did some research in Libya. And Libya is a place where Gaddafi systematically got rid of anything that could look like a parallel state. All nonprofits gone, all independent, anything independent from him and his cronies gone. And even there, over the years, there became sort of sources of power within the families. Very informal, but nevertheless, that was sort of the beginnings, of or what allowed there to be a change there. So if I'm a politician, I'm always worried about other sources of power because they're not me, but they're always there. And I think smart, active politicians manage them and work with those sources of power rather than try to get rid of them because they don't disappear.
So for Turkey to have seen its image transformed internationally in the way that it has is quite an achievement, and that is, I think, in large measure due to Hizmet.
The idea of dialogue between people of different religions, I think, is undoubtedly very important, and the Hizmet movement is definitely at the core of that dialogue between Muslims and people in the United States from my own personal experience.